Welcome to Within You, a podcast that explores the unknown, the liminal space as you navigate between now and what's next. Yo soy Vivian. I'm a wisdom teacher and mindset mentor based in Fort Worth, Texas. And this is a tough conversation to have. This episode is born from several tough conversations lately. June 2020. This country and the world have experienced some massive shifts, beginning with the pandemic, the economic uncertainties that come from that, and then most recently, the death, actually the murder of George Floyd that ignited the entire world into some form of action. It feels tough. It doesn't seem like this is clean for me yet. It's something that I'm experiencing in the moment. It's fresh. And so I felt it was important for me to share with you and actually with myself my lived experience through this time. Much of my growth over the last few years has been a development of courage to resist conformity, a distinguishing between fitting in and belonging. With the light that's been shined on racism is a whole nother level that is very basic. I'm learning new acronyms. It's hard for me to catch my breath right now. So, WOC, woman of color. I am a woman of color. BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, person of color. In addition to those acronyms, I've had interesting experiences, eye-opening experiences. The first one I want to bring to light is my community, Creative Mornings, hosted a conversation with the organizers across the world. They cultivated a space for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to be heard. I love them for that. And I want to share with you that, so it was facilitated online, but at the end of the call, at the end of the gathering, they held space for people of color to speak. And it was a fascinating experience. I hosted a conversation on race. This is super hard to get out. With my comadres, my dancing brujas, the cohort of women who moved through the Modern Elder experience with me. And right now, if Lisa and Jerry, if you're hearing this, I want to thank you for your advocacy, your knowledge and your insight, and your expert facilitation. You've both shown me what it is to be an activist. And you've just been a shining light for me, and I want to thank you for that. I think for me, just having conversations with people close to us is where the courage comes in. I actually have to be honest and say, well, I'm always honest, but I had a conversation, I hosted a conversation on race in Within You, and it opened my eyes. Before I go into that, I want to say that it's really tough. What I've heard from people a lot is that they don't say something because they don't know what to say and they don't want to say the wrong thing. And that can't be good enough. We have to do better. And I have those feelings right now. I'm not sure if what I say is going to be right or good or make things better, but that's the intention that I'm holding. So this conversation on race that I hosted in my community, I just have to literally bow in reverence to the women in my community. Because one of the first things that I realized is that I was exhibiting my own type of racism by not recognizing what I was doing is I feel so comfortable around some of the members, your friends. I've known you for years. And what I was doing is adding Hispanic or Mexican to your nationality when you identify as white. And I recognized that was a bias that I held unconsciously. And so that's one of the things that's begun to unravel for me in this time is my own bias. I think I can count myself pretty lucky because even though I experienced racism for much of my life, I think I felt sheltered from that because of the decades that David served in the military. What this experience and the knowledge and the learning that I'm embarking on is teaching me is lots of the patterns that I would go through are nothing that we go through is alone. It's not an isolated experience by a person. Just been comforting in a way to know that when I experience racism, it's like I question myself, like, did it happen that way? A story, an experience I've been sharing with folks in private conversations has been a recent one actually here in my neighborhood. where a neighbor, we've been riding our bikes because of the social isolation, so you'll see more folks outside, and David and I were riding our bikes down the road where some of the houses haven't been quite built out. And I have a true affinity for rocks lately, so I saw a stack of rocks and I was just going through them. Another family drives by, and the male in the group of the family stops and says to David, "Do you live here? You live in this neighborhood?" This was before anything was on the media about George Floyd or anything sort of popped up. It's just my most recent personal experience. And David says, "Yes, I do. We do live here." And the gentleman says, "Where? Which house? Where do you live?" And David tells him. He says, "Oh, so how long have you lived here?" David says, 8 years. He says, "Oh, I've lived here 6. Nice to meet you." And he leaves. And immediately in that moment, I remember looking at David like, did that just happen? And he's like, whatever. Shrugs his head, shrugs his shoulders. And it brings me back to how difficult it was for me to even move to this neighborhood, as I didn't feel like I belonged. I've grown into my house. Feels very comfortable now. But it was a stretch. And that's what I heard in that conversation, is that question. Do you belong here? I'm not so sure. But we as human beings do that. Are you like me? Or are you like someone else? This is why when I talk about what my parents said that they did, when they took away our culture and encouraged assimilation is literally just wiping away your culture and trying to fit in like a chameleon into the broader culture. That they did it because they thought it'd be easier for me. Maybe it was because of that. 2 things I wrote down that I want to share with you are the teachers that I've gone to. There's so many resources. Luckily, there's so many resources for learning. But my 2 teachers that I want to bring up are Jennifer Ebergart. She's a Stanford professor. She's the author of a book called Biased, Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice that Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. And Jennifer explores the question of how does race shape who we are and how we experience the world. The second teacher is Rasma Menachem. He wrote My Grandmother's Hands. He calls himself a cultural trauma navigator. As a Latina, I know that I personally and collectively as a race, we don't come close to the trauma, the oppression, the violence that our Black brothers and sisters experience. So I'm not centering my experience as the more important one in this conversation. I just wanted to share a little bit about my lived experience recently because of this. How my eyes have been opened to systematic racism that I've ignored or maybe just become accustomed to. Expected even. When we moved to this area, it was difficult to get a rental house while our house was being built. I don't know for certain that that was because of my last name, but I had a sense that it was. So much learning to happen. So much learning is happening. I believe that progress is being made. It's making me see that change is possible. It's building hope that things can be different. It's opening my eyes to all forms of systematic racism, not just in America, but in Australia and in Canada. And it's making me question so many things. It's also making me realize that there's still so much more work to do. Earlier this year, before the spotlight in the media and the protesting and the cosmic shift that's happening, I remember standing up, building courage to say, this is my intention. And this was around finding speakers from the local community for Creative Mornings talks and holding my stance to say that there needed to be diversity, that the faces on the stage needed to be both male and female and include people of color. And for me, I think that's where and how I've seen the people that I personally know and had conversations with, that the courageous acts are different for everyone. Just like I talk about personal practices, spiritual growth, your path is unique to you. We can get caught up in comparing protesting versus donating versus volunteering. And that's not where the attention should be. The attention, for me, is recognizing where I can develop my courage, where I can have more difficult conversations where I can take a stand, where I'm not given permission, but I'm taking a risk. There's still so much work to do. But I believe that change is possible, that we can come closer to a recognition of who we are so that we can see and hear each other. A phrase that I see differently now is one that used pretty commonly with David and I. Not used by us, but said to us. Like, you're not that kind of Mexican. That's not you. A way for someone to, in their head, kind of make their assumptions about an entire race okay by saying that we're different. Soy Mexicana. Soy Latina. And I'm becoming proud of my differentness. You'll notice in previous... God, it's so hard to breathe right now. And I just realized when that came out of my mouth what it reminded me of. George Floyd saying he couldn't breathe. That knee on his neck. Richard Rohr is the leader for an organization called Contemplation, the Center for Contemplation and Action. And that's where my thoughts are meandering to now, is I promote contemplation, stillness, pause, understanding, recognition of your emotions, of your experience, intention with the path that you're creating, and paired with that is action, advocacy. Right now, immediately, my advocacy is in the conversations I'm having, the tough conversations, the recognition of my own body reacting when I speak up in a way that I never have before, reading books and watching movies about police violence and the civil rights movement. Makes me see that we're in our own movement right now, and that individually we're deciding how we're going to move, what we're going to move, because there's so much more work to do. If you're listening to this and you are in the Fort Worth area, and you are a person of color who is interested in taking the stage at Creative Mornings, I'd love for you to reach out to me. Or if you have a friend or a teacher or a mentor based in Fort Worth, Texas, who you'd like to introduce me to, I'd appreciate it if you would. May we continue to teach. May we continue to learn. May we continue to see progress. Because we've already seen that change is possible, and there's still so much more work to do.